Hi and welcome to the workshop. Today we're going to be doing hopefully a short project of cutting and welding up a forge hood, which will go towards the blacksmith setup I've been trying to set up for a while now. So got my sheet metal laying over there on the table saw, and the plan is to make a curved hood design. A curved hood design meaning something that kind of looks like an old French style forge hood. So part of that is getting sheet metal thin enough to bend, but strong enough to be rigid. And the other part of it is actually the pre-tensioning of the metal. And welding it in place like that actually causes additional tension. So it will be a more rigid structure than if you just welded a square box. Anyway, see how it goes. So currently, the first thing my plan is to do is I already have a design laid out on paper. I've cut out little squares and actually looked at how the profile would appear by using different curves, different heights and stacks. I do want it to taper a decent amount towards the top, mostly because there is a 6-inch diameter duct that will be exhausting out any fumes and gases. So, I mean, in theory, you know, having that air accelerate through the hood, really a 14 would be better, but I just don't like the way it looks, to be honest. So, I'm gonna actually go with an 18, and inside of this hood, I may end up putting like a shell on the inside in order to encourage all the airflow to be taken from the edges. Which will create a much faster draft on the edges and less chance of gases escaping if the fumes produced are a larger volume than what the suction duct up there can take out. One of the first steps is to make a template. I need these curves to be exactly the same in order to match up on the corners once I bend the material. I mean, obviously there's, you know, some allowances for not being exactly precise, but one of the easiest ways to make a consistent curve, I thought about taking a smooth piece of wood and bending it and just taking whatever bend that took on, but wood has irregularities in density and things like that. So I ended up settling on this method where I'm going to take a string and basically make the source of the string perpendicular to this board, and the highest height of the arc will be 3 inches, and then it will taper down to each corner. So it will actually be a string that I'm going to tie on a piece of plywood somewhere else in the workshop. I haven't figured that out yet. Let's see how it goes. While lining up this template board, initially I thought about trying to have a perpendicular off the edge, going down and somewhere secured down there and walking that board in until the string radius would basically trace to the edges of each side with the deepest angle in the middle of the curve, so that it would be a a perfect round curve. But then I got to thinking about it and decided kind of against that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay boards that are approximately perpendicular to where this curve would be on the edges on each side, and wherever they intersect or indicate intersecting, that's where I'll put the screw instead. That'll be a much easier way of getting this done rather than trial and error. Alright, success. So after that, basically I used a chalk line and a few screws in order to line this up in a perfectly tangent way to both the peak of the curve and the reference line. And with that I was able to draw a perfect round curve between the 2 points. For this we're going to cut this out and obviously sand it very carefully in a long way in order to get it as smooth as possible. This is going to be our cutting guide for the nibbler attachment. But I have a few more things to do. I'm going to actually cut the ends off this and mark them and screw them on perpendicular, not quite perpendicular, but in a way that I can use it almost like a speed square on the edge of the steel. So once I clamp it down, it is oriented perfectly each time for every cut. So there are 2 reasons you're not getting more context videos of me moving stuff around. Number 1, I'm still on crutch. Not crutches, just crutch. And I need my exercise. So this is part of my rehabilitation. That's my story, I'm sticking with it. And the other reason is that, well, I don't have a camera mounted yet, or even a decent camera. This is my first official video of workshop time. Don't know what I'll call it yet. So I'm going to take us over to my trusty, functional but not ideal Shopsmith setup and cut it out. In this case, as with any other, there are imperfections in this. You know, I could use a laminate bit with a template, but I don't have a template yet. So this is going to be just done by hand. And again, these curves are going to be symmetrical, and you know, basically two pairs of mirror opposites in the actual forged hood. So whatever this curve is, it doesn't really matter as long as it's the same, but I'm going to try and get it as smooth as possible. And after a light sanding, we have a perfect, and well, not perfect, but you know, pretty close, and reproducible curve for a nibbler to follow. Now, I've actually thought about it, and my plan is I'm going to actually mark the top here, cut above it, and then put two slots on each side so that this can be used as a reversible template, almost like a T. So I can place it on there, clamp the top, clamp the bottom, and it will be positioned more consistently that way. Better than with my eye, anyhow. So it turned out the angle that this was oriented to the sheet metal was 31 degrees. I've got my two marks there. They are 3 1/4 inches apart. I'm going to rip the remainder down into 3 1/4 inch strips and use each one to go parallel to, or not parallel, but perpendicular. You know what I mean. There we go. So as we've been proceeding, you can see we already have two cut out using the guide. Huh?
You don't need to use this now, do you?
Yeah, we do for a guide.
Okay.
Just so it's a steady cut.
Ah.
All right. Buddy Norman's over. It's always good.
Yes, sir.
All right, here we go. So the idea being that this nibbler chews about 1/4 of an inch off the edge of the wood, and in this case we want that white line gone, so we're going to shift this 1/8 of an inch to the side. Let's see how it goes. Now those nibblers look pretty fancy. I remember seeing it online and thinking, wow, what a great way to cut out metal without using an abrasive disc or a jigsaw. And it does have its benefits, but the thing they don't tell you is that the nibblers don't punch out perfect little round holes, like a hole punch. What they cut out is they cut out tiny little crescent circles. And if the metal you're cutting, actually I think regardless of the thickness, what it does is it creates these razor sharp, tiny little staples that get stuck in everything, if you're cutting steel especially. And so I was picking little tiny staples. I still am picking little tiny staples out of every pair of shoes that I wear in the workshop. Number 7? No, 6.
Cut number 6. Switching up angles.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, we're out of juice. That's battery. So we're all done with our cutting. We even used a radius tool with the nibbler in order to cut a round hole, almost perfect, into this sheet of metal. I think there's a way to offset that hole, but I'm not too worried about it, as that'll be a duct connection anyway. And we're ready to pyramid these and start welding.
Nice.
Now it's time to start welding it up. I cut out an 18 by 18 top, 18 by 18 inches, And I'm going to start welding those first, and the reason is that I'm actually going to end up pinning this together upside down initially, because I believe that I'm going to be able to get the top on there securely, and then I can bend the bottom out. Workshop for today, maybe a couple hours, maybe half an hour. We'll see when work starts. But for the moment, we're still working on the forge hood design. I got to the point where I have it clamped up with straight edges to hold the tops of it rigid. The idea being that if I welded the tips and then continued to bend it, that weld would be at the wrong angle, and I would either have to cut it or grind it and continue to re-weld. Rather than do that, I'd rather get it bent into one position so I could make sure it's square and evenly bent, and then tack weld it from there. So I've got the bottom 6 inches done up. Looks like I can't flip this camera. And what I need to do, I've kind of come to the realization, is build a frame that can bridge across the entire top, and then make it rigid enough where I can put a spreading clamp on the ceiling and then bend it down so that all sides will equally bend down and close this gap here. And once the gap's closed, obviously tack weld it, bend it, shift it around until all the sides are tight. So that's the plan for right now, is just to build that frame, get these other clamps off here, get this thing nestled down inside that frame, and then start to apply some pressure and see if this works. Okay, so my lack of planning is evident now. As I was bending this in, we got good connectivity up about another 6 to 8 inches, and then this big gap that just, the only way it will close is if I invert this curve, and that this actually ends up bending down, so it's almost like a Chinese style ornamental roof. You can see the gaps in the top here. So the only realistic option I can think of is I'm going to slowly take some of the pressure off of these clamps to line up these edges a little bit more, tack weld whatever I can, and then I may end up just getting some strips. I was going to do some ornamental strips on the corners anyway, and then just tack welding it with some scrap pieces and then putting ornamental strips in the corner. The other option is I may end up just doing an inverse bend. The only downside is doing that will require that I squeeze the corners in somewhat. So I may end up doing that, overlapping those, tack welding it, and then just from the inside, and then just running an angle grinder down it. So we'll see. Okay, so I've got a plan. I'm basically going to keep going with the curve, and whatever it comes out to is what it comes out to. So right now I've got another 6 inches of seam that's connected, so I'm going to go ahead and tack weld it, and then take this bending frame off and see what I have to do to get everything else to match up.